The earth gave way grudgingly, one shovelful at a time. Sweat traced clean paths through the dust caked on Abram's face, stinging his eyes as it dripped from his brow. Behind him, the late summer sun beat down on the valley, turning the distant grasses to a pale, shimmering gold. But here, pressed against the cool flank of the northern hill, he found a sliver of shade. He was carving a wound into the land, a deep, rectangular hollow that bled red clay and dark soil. It was an unnatural thing to witness, this deliberate excavation. From the track below, two riders had stopped, their figures dark against the blinding glare. Abram didn't need to see their faces to know who they were. The valley was a small place, and its judgments traveled fast. He kept digging, the rhythmic scrape and thud of his shovel the only answer to their silent appraisal. Finally, a voice, dry and brittle as autumn leaves, cut through the afternoon haze. A man digs a hole for one of two reasons. Either he's burying treasure or he's lost his mind. Malachi Thorne's tone was laced with a particular kind of amusement, the sort reserved for watching a fool prove his foolishness. His companion, a younger man named Ben, chuckled nervously. Abram paused, leaning on his shovel handle. He squinted at them, his silence a wall they had to shout over. "It's for the cattle," he said, his voice rough from dust and disuse. Malachi shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking in protest. "For the cattle? You're digging them a grave before the winter even starts. A bit pessimistic, aren't you, Abram?" The sarcasm was thick, intended to draw a reaction, to make him defensive. But Abram simply drove the shovel back into the earth. "It's a barn," he clarified, not looking up. A shelter this time. Malachi's laugh was loud and unrestrained, a harsh bark that startled a nearby crow into flight. "A barn? In a hole? What sort of nonsense is that? Barns are built of timber and sweat, up in the clean air, not burrowed into the ground like a badger. You'll flood them out in the first rain or smother them in the first snow." He gestured expansively at the valley, at his own sprawling ranch visible miles away, its proud, tall barn a monument to conventional wisdom. "That is a barn, son. What you're making there, that's just a fool's folly." Abram said nothing more. He just kept digging. The sun fell lower, stretching the riders' shadows until they were long, distorted things that reached for him, their mockery clinging to the cooling air long after they had ridden away. He worked until the light failed, his muscles screaming a protest that his mind refused to hear. The hole was deeper now, a dark mouth gaping at the star-dusted sky. The idea had not been born of madness, but of quiet desperation whispered over a meager fire. It was Samuel who had planted the seed, an old, weather-beaten man who lived on the edge of the territory, his face a roadmap of hard seasons and harder wisdom. He had appeared at Abram's small cabin one evening as autumn began to bleed into the landscape, sharing a cup of bitter coffee and a silence that was more comfortable than most men's conversation. Samuel had watched the sky for days, his gaze fixed on the patterns of migrating birds and the frantic industry of the forest's smallest creatures. "They know something we've chosen to forget," he'd said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "The earth has a memory, and a breath. In the summer, it exhales the heat. In the winter, it holds its warmth deep inside." Abram had listened, intrigued by the old man's poetic turn of phrase. Most ranchers spoke of windbreaks and hay bales, of timber thickness and roof pitch. They spoke of fighting the winter, of dominating it. Samuel spoke of understanding it. "I saw a winter once, as a boy, that froze the rivers solid to the bottom," Samuel continued, staring into the flames. "It came fast and stayed long. Men who thought their barns were fortresses found only frozen statues inside when the thaw finally came. The wind, you see, the wind is a thief. It steals the heat from every crack, every seam. It finds its way through the thickest walls." He then told Abram about the buffalo, how in the worst blizzards they would find a deep ravine or press themselves against a sheer cliff face, letting the snow drift over them, using the land itself as a blanket. "They don't fight the storm," Samuel had concluded, his eyes locking with Abram's. "They become part of the mountain until it passes." He had risen to leave, pausing at the door. "That north hill on your land, the soil is deep there. It holds the memory of the sun longer than any other place in this valley." That was all he said. It was not advice, not an instruction. It was an observation, a piece of knowledge offered without expectation. But for Abram, who had arrived in the valley with little more than a handful of cattle and the deed to a patch of undesirable, hilly land, it was a lifeline. He had no funds for a grand timber barn like Malachi Thorne's, no crew of hands to raise it. He had only his own 2 hands, a strong back, and a seed of an idea that everyone else in the valley would soon call madness. The memory of that conversation fueled him now, a quiet fire in his gut that burned hotter than the sun above. The work became his entire world. From the first hint of dawn until the last vestiges of twilight, Abram was a creature of the earth, his skin stained with its ruddy pigment, his muscles aching with the strain of moving it. He felled trees from the small woodlot on his property, not for walls, but for the strong interior posts and the massive ridgepole that would form the spine of the structure. He learned the language of the soil, the soft, yielding loam on top, the stubborn, rocky clay beneath, and the surprising coolness that lingered just a few feet below the surface, a promise of the earth's insulating power. Passers-by became a regular feature of his days. Some would stop and stare, their curiosity plain. Others, bolder and steeped in Malachi's certainty, would offer unsolicited advice. "You'll never keep the roof from caving in," one declared, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the pit's edge. "That's a den for wolves you're building, not a home for cattle," another warned. Abram offered little in return, his responses brief and non-committal. His energy was a finite resource, and he would not waste it on arguments. Instead, he channeled it into the labor. He hewed the logs with a broad axe, the clean scent of pine filling the air. He wrestled the heavy beams into place, using a simple system of levers and ramps, his movement slow and deliberate. The front of the structure began to take shape, a heavy timber frame set deep into the excavated hillside, looking like the entrance to some ancient tomb. He built a low rock wall to line the earthen sides, preventing collapse, each stone chosen and placed with patient care. The valley was ablaze with the colors of fall, a riot of orange, red, and gold. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decay. While other ranchers were busy with the final tally of their herds and mending fences, Abram was hauling buckets of sod, laying them carefully over the roof beams. He was creating a living roof, a blanket of earth and grass that would merge the structure back into the hill it came from. He was not building on the land, he was building with it. His isolation was complete now. He was a curiosity, a local spectacle. That fool's barn had become a landmark. But as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He was not just building a shelter, he was keeping a promise to himself, honoring a piece of wisdom that the rest of the world had dismissed as nonsense. The confrontation he had been avoiding finally found him. It was a Saturday, the one day he allowed himself the trip to the small settlement for supplies. The general store was warm, smelling of coffee, leather, and dried apples. It was also crowded. As Abram placed his sack of flour on the counter, he felt a heavy presence behind him. Malachi Thorne stood there, his face set in a grim expression that was somehow more unnerving than his earlier mockery. He wasn't smiling now. "Abram," he said, his voice low enough for only those nearby to hear, but carrying an authority that commanded attention. The low hum of conversation in the store faltered. "I had hoped you would come to your senses by now." Abram turned slowly, meeting the older man's hard gaze. "I'm sensible enough," Malachi gestured dismissively with a gloved hand. "Sensible? You're digging a pit on a perfectly good hill and planning to shove your livestock into it. You're inviting disease, dampness, and disaster. It's an embarrassment." He took a step closer, his voice dropping further, taking on a tone of paternalistic concern that was far more insulting than open ridicule. "Men like us, we have a responsibility. We are stewards of the land and the animals on it. Our methods are proven, passed down because they work. What you are doing, it's a rejection of all that. It's arrogant." The word hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Abram felt the eyes of the other men in the store on him. He saw doubt in some, agreement in others. He was an outsider, not just in his methods, but in his history. He hadn't inherited his land, he had bought it, a fact that still marked him as separate. "My methods are my own concern," Abram stated, his voice even. And my cattle are my own responsibility, but your failure will be a stain on this whole valley. Malachi's voice rose, the pretense of quiet counsel slipping. When your animals die of lung rot in that damp hole, people will say this is a place where ranchers don't know how to care for their stock. You're a fool, and your foolishness affects us all. A tense silence filled the store. The storekeeper busied himself polishing a clean counter. Ben, Malachi's silent companion from that first day, looked at the floorboards. Abram picked up his sack of flour. I suppose we'll find out when winter comes, he said, his voice devoid of challenge. It was a simple statement of fact. He paid for his goods and walked out, the weight of the community's judgment heavier than any sack he could carry. He didn't look back. The cold certainty of the coming season was all that mattered now. The final piece was the door, a massive, double-layered construction of thick planks, cross-braced and heavy. It fit snugly into the timber frame, the only part of the structure that looked anything like a conventional barn. When he swung it shut for the first time, the world outside vanished. The bright, crisp autumn afternoon was replaced by a deep, resonant quiet. The only light came from the gaps he'd left high in the front wall, narrow slits that would let in air but not the weather. The air inside was cool but not cold, and it carried the clean, primal scent of damp earth, stone, and curing wood. It smelled ancient and safe. His work was done. The exterior was almost invisible from a distance, the sod roof already blending with the brown grasses of the hillside. It was less a building and more a feature of the landscape, a gentle mound with a wooden face. Now came the true test. He went out to his small herd, their breath pluming in the chilly air. They were hardy animals, but the wind was picking up, carrying a new and sharper edge. He called to them, his voice low and calm, and began to lead them toward the dark opening in the hill. They were hesitant at first, sniffing suspiciously at the threshold. The darkness was unfamiliar, the smell strange. One of the older cows balked, turning away. Abram didn't force her. He simply walked inside himself, scattering a bit of fresh hay on the packed earth floor. He waited. Patience, he was learning, was a tool as vital as any shovel or axe. After a moment, a younger, more curious steer poked its head inside, then took a tentative step. Another followed. Soon, the old cow, not wanting to be left out, relented and joined the others. Within minutes, the entire herd was inside. The space was large enough for them to move comfortably, but small enough that their collective body heat would make a difference. They settled quickly, their soft snorts and the rustle of their movements muffled by the earthen walls. The deep quiet returned, a profound stillness that was the absolute opposite of the wind whining outside. Abram stood among them, running a hand along the flank of a calm heifer. This was his victory. It was private, silent, and witnessed by no one but the animals who would depend on it. He felt the subtle warmth rising from them, the faintest humidity in the air. Outside, the world could mock and the wind could howl. In here, in the heart of the hill, there was only a steady, quiet peace. He had not built a fool's folly. He had built a sanctuary. The first snow came without fanfare, a surprise flurry in late October that dusted the valley in a thin, fragile layer of white. It was gone by noon, a mere whisper of the season to come, but it was enough to start the talk in town. It set the ranchers to their final preparations, their confidence bolstered by the sight of their own formidable barns, their lofts overflowing with hay. They were ready. They were always ready. Abram heard them at the smithy, their voices loud and self-assured as they waited for tools to be mended. Just a little taste, one of them said, clapping his gloved hands together. The real cold won't settle in for another month yet. Plenty of times Malachi Thorne was there, holding court as usual. He spoke of the thickness of his barn walls, of the new iron hinges on his hayloft doors, of the precise number of bales he had calculated would be needed per head of cattle until spring. It was a science to him, a matter of established fact and proven engineering. Preparation is everything, he announced to the assembled group. A man who leaves things to chance in this country is a man who'll be burying his herd come the thought. He glanced over and saw Abram standing by the doorway, his gaze unreadable. A slow, knowing smile spread across Malachi's face. Some, of course, prefer to trust in alternative methods. Digging holes, for instance, a few of the men chuckled. The blacksmith, a man of few words, kept his eyes on the glowing metal on his anvil, the rhythmic ringing of his hammer the only sound for a long moment. Abram felt the familiar sting of their condescension, but it was duller now, blunted by the memory of the deep quiet inside his hillside shelter. He no longer needed their approval. He had stepped outside their world of straight lines and rigid rules. He was listening to a different kind of wisdom now, the ancient, patient wisdom of the earth itself. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward Malachi, not in deference, but in acknowledgement. A silent promise that time would render its own verdict. He left the smithy, the sound of their confident laughter following him out into the cold, clean air. The sky was clear, a brilliant, unforgiving blue. But on the northern horizon, a line of dark, heavy clouds was gathering, a bruise against the pale edge of the world. The whisper was over. The winter was about to speak. It arrived not as a storm, but as an invasion. The change began subtly, a shift in the quality of the light, a sudden, profound silence as the birds and insects ceased their chatter. Then the sky, which had been a crisp winter blue, began to fade to a dull, milky gray, the color of lead. The temperature didn't just drop, it was stolen, leached from the world by a force that felt malevolent and alive. The wind came next, a low moan from the north that grew steadily into a relentless, shrieking gale. It carried no snow at first, just the cold itself, a dry, razor-sharp cold that found its way through the tightest woven wool and the thickest planked walls. It was a hunter, and it was seeking warmth. The valley, once open and sprawling, seemed to shrink, its landmarks swallowed by the grey expanse. The world was reduced to the immediate, the tangible, the ground beneath one's feet, the air that burned in one's lungs. Abram moved his cattle into the hillside barn just as the first flakes of snow began to fly. They were not flakes, but tiny, hard pellets of ice, driven horizontally by the wind. They scoured the landscape, stripping the last dead leaves from the trees and sandblasting the exposed faces of the barns that dotted the valley. Inside his shelter, the transition was astonishing. The moment he pulled the heavy door shut, the shriek of the wind was reduced to a distant, muffled hum. The frantic, biting cold was replaced by a calm, stable coolness. The air was still. His cattle, already accustomed to the space, settled without protest, their large bodies generating a slow, steady warmth that was trapped by the surrounding earth. He checked the narrow ventilation slits, they were high enough to be above any drifting, letting in fresh air without creating a draft. He spread fresh hay, the scent filling the enclosed space. He could feel the storm's fury through the soles of his boots, a low vibration in the ground, but it was the anger of a caged beast raging against impenetrable walls. The earth was holding. He had placed his trust not in his own construction, but in the immense, unyielding mass of the hill itself. For the first time in days, the knot of tension in his stomach began to loosen. He had done all he could. Now, he and his animals were in the keeping of the mountain. Malachi Thorne cursed as another gust of wind tore a loose board from the western wall of his barn. The sound was a sharp crack, like a gunshot, followed by the high-pitched scream of nails being ripped from wood. Through the new opening, a torrent of icy snow blasted into the cavernous space, coating a section of the hay bales in a sheath of white. His barn, his magnificent, state-of-the-art barn, was failing. It stood proud and tall on an open plain, a perfect target for the northern gale. The wind hammered at it from all sides, a physical assault that made the entire structure groan and tremble. Every seam, every joint, every tiny crack was a breach, a conduit for the killing cold. His cattle were huddled together in the center of the barn, a miserable, shivering mass. Their coats were rimed with frost, their breath freezing in crystalline clouds. They were bellowing, a low, constant sound of distress that grated on his nerves. He had done everything right, everything the way it was supposed to be done. He had more hay than he could possibly need, his walls were thick, his roof was sound. But he had never accounted for a wind like this. A wind that didn't just go around, but went through. He and his two ranch hands worked frantically, stuffing rags and extra bits of burlap into the ever-widening cracks, but it was like trying to dam a river with bare hands. The cold was winning. It was an insidious, pervasive enemy, and it was everywhere. By the second morning of the storm, he found the first casualty, a young calf, frozen solid in the lee of its mother. The sight broke something in him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was Malachi Thorne. His ranch was the model of success, his methods the gold standard for the entire region. He was in control. But as he stood there, the wind howling its triumphant song through the bones of his failing barn, he felt a profound and terrifying powerlessness. His pride, as sturdy and imposing as his barn had seemed, was being dismantled, board by frozen board. He thought of Abram. He pictured the man's foolish, ridiculous hole in the ground, and for the first time, the image didn't bring a sneer of contempt, but a flicker of something else. A desperate, gnawing, an utterly unthinkable question: what if the fool was right? Ben stumbled through the snow, his body bent nearly double against the wind. The world was a churning vortex of white and grey, and he navigated by memory alone, keeping the shape of the northern hills in his mind. He had left Malachi's ranch against orders. There was nothing more they could do there but watch things die. Another 2 head of cattle had been lost during the night, and Malachi had retreated into a grim, unapproachable silence. Ben wasn't sure what he was looking for. Help? A witness to the valley's shared misery? Or maybe just to see for himself if Abram's folly had collapsed, burying the man and his herd in a tomb of his own making. The thought was grim, but it seemed the most likely outcome. As he drew nearer to Abram's property, he noticed something strange. The sound. The relentless, deafening roar of the wind seemed to lessen here, baffled by the contours of the hill. The homestead itself was eerily quiet. Abram's small cabin was dark, a drift of snow piled high against its door. For a terrifying moment, Ben thought he was too late. Then he saw it, the low, dark line of the barn's timbered front, almost completely blended into a massive snowdrift. There was no sign of life. No sound. He waded through the deep snow, his heart pounding. He reached the heavy wooden door, expecting it to be frozen shut or blocked entirely. But a narrow path had been kept clear, and as he laid a hand on the wood, he could feel a faint, almost imperceptible vibration from within. He hesitated for only a second before pulling it open just enough to peer inside. The sight that met his eyes was so contrary to his expectations that he couldn't immediately process it. The air that washed over him was not frigid, but cool and still, thick with the warm, animal scent of living creatures. In the dim light, he saw them, Abram's entire herd, standing or lying peacefully in the hay. There was no shivering, no panic bellowing. They were calm, placid, their coats sleek and dry. In the corner, Abram himself was sitting on a stool, methodically cleaning a piece of tack. He looked up, his expression not of surprise, but of quiet expectation, as if he'd been waiting. "Ben," he said, his voice calm. "Shut the door." "You're letting the winter in." Ben stared, dumbfounded, from the serene scene inside to the raging blizzard behind him. It was impossible. The fool's barn wasn't a tomb. It was an ark. When the storm finally broke after 4 days of unrelenting fury, it left behind a world transformed and silenced. The valley lay buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white, the snow so deep it softened every edge and erased every road. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the sun, when it appeared, was a weak, distant thing, offering light but no warmth. The silence was the most unsettling part. It was the silence of exhaustion, the silence of loss. As the survivors began to emerge from their homes, the true cost of the great winter storm began to reveal itself. Fences had vanished, sheds had collapsed, and from nearly every ranch came the grim news of lost livestock. The wind and the cold had been a ruthless cull. The worst reports came from the Thorne Ranch. The great barn was crippled, its western wall shattered, its interior a frozen landscape of snowdrifts and sorrow. Malachi had lost more than half his herd, the product of years of careful breeding and hard work, gone in a handful of days. He was a changed man. The arrogant certainty was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. He moved like an old man, directing his remaining hands to the grim task of clearing the dead, his voice a monotone, devoid of its former authority. No one dared approach him with condolences. His grief was a wall as formidable as the storm itself. Abram, meanwhile, led his cattle out of the hillside. They emerged into the dazzling, snow-bright world, blinking in the unfamiliar light, but they were healthy, strong, and whole. Every single one had survived. He didn't gloat, didn't ride into town to proclaim his victory. There was no need. The proof was there, steaming and breathing in the cold morning air. From a high ridge overlooking the valley, Samuel watched the scene unfold. He saw the quiet devastation at the Thorn Ranch and the quiet miracle at Abram's Hill. He saw Abram moving among his cattle, a small, resilient figure in a vast, white world. Their eyes met across the distance. No words were exchanged, none were necessary. A slow, respectful nod passed between the old man on the mountain and the quiet rancher in the valley. The triumph was not in being right, but in surviving. It was a lesson the earth had always been willing to teach, but only to those who were humble enough to listen.